From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Death Bogle and the Inextinguishable Candle. Years ago, bent on revisiting Perthshire, a part of Scotland which had great attraction for me as a boy, I answered an advertisement in a popular ladies' weekly. It was somewhat to this effect: comfortable home offered to gentleman bachelor at moderate terms in an elderly Highland ladies' house at Pitlochry. Must be a strict teetotaler and non-smoker. F.M. Box. The naivety and originality of the advertisement appealed to me. The idea of obtaining as a boarder a young man combining such virtues as abstinence from alcohol and tobacco was very amusing. And a bachelor, too. Did she mean to make advances to him herself? The sly old thing. She took care to insert the description elderly in order to avoid suspicion. But there could be little doubt about it. She thirsted for matrimony. There rose up before me visions of a tall, angular, 40-ish Scottish spinster with high cheekbones, sandy hair, and brawny arms. A daunting prospect. Yet it was Pitlochry, heavenly Pitlochry, and there was no one else advertising in that town. So I decided to write to F.M. For once, my instincts were all wrong. The advertiser, Miss Flora MacDonald of MacDonald Murray House, did not resemble my preconception of her in the least. She was of medium height and dainty build, a fairy-like creature dressed in rustling silks, with wavy white hair, bright blue eyes, straight, delicate features, and hands the shape and slenderness of which at once pronounced her a psychic. She greeted me with a stately courtesy. My luggage was taken upstairs by a solemn-eyed lad in a MacDonald tartan, and the tea-bell rang me down to fruit salad and cream, scones, and delicious buttered toast. I fell in love with my hostess. It would be sheer sacrilege to call such a tender creature landlady at once. The food was all that could be desired, and my bedroom, sweet with the perfume of jasmine and roses, presented a picture of dainty cleanliness. It transpired that Miss MacDonald was a Jacobite, and in a discussion on the association of her romantic namesake, Flora MacDonald, with Perthshire, it leaked out that our respective ancestors had commanded battalions in Louis XIV's far-famed Scottish and Irish brigades. That discovery bridged gulfs. We were no longer payer and paid. We were friends. Friends for life. A week or so later, I had settled in Miss MacDonald's home. I took, at her suggestion, a rest from my writing and spent the day on Loch Tay, leaving again for Donald Murray House at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was a brilliant moonlit night. Not a cloud in the sky, and the landscape stood out almost as clearly as in the daytime. I cycled, and after a hard but thoroughly enjoyable ride, eventually came to a standstill on the high road, a mile or two from the first lights of the village of Pitlochry. I halted, not through fatigue, for I was almost as fresh as when I started, but because I was entranced with the delightful atmosphere, and wanted to draw in a few really deep draughts of it before returning home to bed. My stopping place was on a triangular plot of grass at the junction of 4 roads. I propped my cycle against a signpost and looked back in the direction from which I had ridden. I remained in this attitude for about 10 minutes, and was about to remount my cycle when I suddenly became icy cold. and a frightful, hideous terror seized and gripped me so hard that the machine, slipping from my trembling hands, fell to the ground with a crash. The next instant something, for the life of me I know not what, its outline was so blurred and indefinite, alighted on the open space in front of me with a soft thud, and remained standing as bolt upright as a cylindrical pillar. From afar off there then came the low rumble of wheels, which grew in intensity until there lumbered into view a wagon, weighed down beneath a huge stack of hay, on the top of which sat a man in a wide-brimmed straw hat. He was deep in conversation with a boy in corduroys, who sprawled beside him. The horse, catching sight of the motionless thing opposite me, at once stood still and snorted violently. The man cried out, "Hey, hey, what's the matter with you, beast?" And then, in a hysterical kind of screech, "Great God! What's yon figure, Thames?" The boy immediately raised himself into a kneeling position, and clutching hold of the man's arm, screamed, I dinna ken, Matthew, but take heed, mon, it does not touch me. It's me it's come after, not ye." The moonlight was so strong that the faces of the speakers were revealed to me with extraordinary vividness, and their horrified expressions were even more startling than was the silent, ghastly figure on the roadside. The scene comes back to me as I write, its every detail as clearly marked as on the night it was first enacted. The long range of cone-shaped mountains darkly silhouetted against the silvery sky, the shining, scaly surface of some far-off tarn or river, visible only at intervals because of the thick clusters of gently nodding pines, the whitewashed walls of cottages glistening amid the dark green denseness of thickly leaved box trees, the undulating meadows, besprinkled with gorse and grotesquely molded crags of granite, the dazzling white roads, saturated with moonbeams. I even counted the horn buttons on the rustic's coat. One was missing from the man's, two from the boy's, and noted the sweat stains under the armpits of Matthew's shirt, and the dents and tears in Tam's soft, wide-awake hat. I took in all those trivialities and more besides. I saw the abrupt rise and fall of the man's chest as his breath came in sharp jerks, and the stream of dirty saliva that oozed from between his blackberry-stained lips and dribbled down his chin. I saw their hands, the man's square-fingered, black-nailed, big-veined, shiny with perspiration, and clutching grimly at the reins. The boy's smaller, and if anything rather more grimy, the one pressed flat down the hay, the other extended in front of him, the palms stretched outwards and all the fingers widely apart. And while all these minute details were being stamped on my brain, the cause of all our terror, the indefinable, mysterious column stood silent and motionless over against the hedge, bathed in a baleful glow. The horse suddenly broke the spell. Dashing its head forward, it went off at a gallop, and tearing frantically past the glowing column, went helter-skelter down the road to my left. The wagon's violent passage threw Tammas into a somersault, and he was miraculously saved from falling head-first onto the road by rebounding from the pitchfork which had been wedged upright in the hay. At this moment, the suddenly mobile phantom figure, which had followed in their wake with prodigious bounds, began to grope for Tammas with spidery arms. Whether it succeeded in touching the boy, I cannot say, for I was so horribly frightened that it would return to me, that I jumped on my cycle and rode as I had never ridden before, and have never ridden since. When I told Miss MacDonald of my extraordinary experience, she was very concerned. "It was stupid of me not to have warned you," she said. "That particular spot in the road has always, at least, ever since I can remember, borne the reputation of being haunted. None of the people round here will venture within a mile of it after twilight, so the carters you saw must have been strangers. No one has ever seen the ghost except in the misty form in which it appeared to you. It does not frequent the place every night, It only appears periodically, and its method never varies. It leaps over a wall or hedge, remains stationary till someone approaches, and then pursues them with monstrous springs. The person it touches invariably dies within a year. I well recollect, when I was in my teens, on just such a night as this, driving home with my father from Lady Colin Ferner's croquet party at Blair Athol. When we got to the spot you named, the horse shied, and before I could realize what had happened, we were racing home at a terrific pace. My father and I sat in front, and the groom, a Highland boy from the valley of Beniglo, behind. Never having seen my father frightened, his agitation now seriously alarmed me, and the more so as my instinct told me it was caused by something other than the mere bolting of the horse. I was soon enlightened. A gigantic figure with leaps and bounds suddenly overtook us, and thrusting out its long thin arms, touched my father lightly on the hand. Then, with a harsh cry, more like that of some strange animal than that of a human being, it disappeared. Neither of us spoke till we reached home. I did not live here then, but in a house on the other side of Pitlochry, when my father, who was still as white as a sheet, took me aside and whispered, "Whatever you do, Flora, don't breathe a word of what has happened to your mother, and never let her go alone that road at night. It was the Death Bogle. I shall die within 12 months." And he did. Miss MacDonald paused, and then after a brief silence went on with all her customary briskness. "I cannot describe the thing any more than you can, except that it gave me the impression it had no eyes. But what it was, whether the ghost of a man, woman, or some peculiar beast, I could not tell. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, have you had enough horrors for one evening, or would you like to hear just once more?" Well, shaken up as I was after my experience, my curiosity now was thoroughly roused, and so I asked Miss MacDonald to continue. "After my father's death," she said, "I told my mother about our adventure that night. We drove home from Lady Colin Ferner's party, and asked her if she remembered ever having heard anything that could possibly account for the phenomenon. After a few reflection, this is the story she told me. And here I give the story as told to Miss MacDonald by her mother, whose maiden name was Trevor. There was once a house known as the Old White House, that used to stand by the side of the road, close to where you say the horse first took fright. Some people of the name of Halkett, relations of dear old Sir Arthur Halkett, and great friends of ours, used to live there. The house, it was popularly believed, had been built on the site of an ancient burial ground. Everyone used to say it was haunted, and the Halketts had great trouble in getting servants. The appearance of the Old White House did not belie its reputation, for its grey walls, sombre garden, gloomy hall, dark passages and staircase, and sinister-looking attics could not have been more thoroughly suggestive of all kinds of ghostly phenomena. Moreover, the whole atmosphere of the place, no matter how hot and bright the sun, was cold and dreary, and it was a constant source of wonder to everyone how Lady Halkett could live there. She was, however, always cheerful, and used to tell me that nothing could induce her to leave a spot dear to so many generations of her family, and associated with the happiest recollections in her life. She was very fond of company, and there was scarcely a week in the year in which she had not someone staying with her. I can only remember her as a widow, her husband, a major in the Gordon Highlanders, having died in India before I was born. She had 2 daughters, Margaret and Alice, both considered very good-looking, but some years older than I. This difference in age, however, did not prevent our being on very friendly terms, and I was constantly invited to their house, in the summer to croquet and archery, in the winter to balls. Like most elderly ladies of that period, Lady Halkett was very fond of cards, and she and my mother used frequently to play bezique and cribbage, while the girls and I indulged in something rather more frivolous. On those occasions the carriage always came for us at 10, since my mother, for some reason or other, I had a shrewd suspicion it was on account of the alleged haunting, would never return home after that time. When she accepted an invitation to a ball, it was always conditional that Lady Holkit would put us both up for the night, and the carriage then came for us the following day after lunch. I shall never forget the last time I went to a dance at the old white house. My mother had not been very well for some weeks, having, so she thought, taken cold internally. She had not had a doctor, partly because she did not feel ill enough, and partly because the only medical man near us was an apothecary, of whose skill she had a very poor opinion. My mother had quite made up her mind to accompany me to the ball, but at the last moment, the weather being appalling, she yielded to advice, and my Aunt Nora, who was staying with us at the time, chaperoned me instead. It was snowing when we set out, and as it snowed all through the night and most of the next day, the roads were completely blocked, and we had to remain at the old white house from Monday evening until the following Thursday. Aunt Nora and I occupied separate bedrooms, and mine was at the end of a long passage away from everybody else's. Prior to this, my mother and I had always shared a room, the only really pleasant one, so I thought, in the old house, overlooking the front lawn. But on this occasion, as there were so many visitors stranded at the house like ourselves, we had to squeeze in wherever we could, and as my aunt and I were to have separate rooms, my aunt liking a room to herself, it was natural that she should be given the largest and most comfortable. Consequently, she was situated in the wing where all the other visitors slept, while I was forced to retreat to a passage on the other side of the house where, with the exception of my apartment, there was nothing but lumber rooms. All went smoothly and happily till the night before we returned home. We had supper, and Margaret and I were ascending the staircase on our way to bed when Alice, who had run upstairs ahead of us, ran down again looking very frightened. "Oh, do come to my room," she cried. "Something has happened to Mary," which was one of the housemaids. We both ran up with her, and on entering her room found Mary seated on a chair, sobbing hysterically. One only had to glance at the girl to see that she was suffering from very severe shock. Though normally red-cheeked and placid, a very reliable girl, and the last person to be easily perturbed, she was now without a vestige of color, while the pupils of her eyes were dilated with terror. Her entire body, from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet, shook as if with ague. "Why, Mary!" Margaret exclaimed. "Whatever's the matter? What has happened?" "It's the candle, miss," the girl gasped. "The candle in Miss Trevor's room. I can't put it out." "You can't put it out? Why, what nonsense!" Margaret said. "But it's true, miss, true as I sit here," Mary insisted. "I put the candle on the mantelpiece while I set the room to rights, and when I had finished and come to blow it out, I couldn't. I blew and blew and blew, but it hadn't any effect, and then I grew afraid, miss, horribly afraid." She buried her face in her hands and shuddered. "I've never been frightened like this before, miss, and I've come away and left the candle burning." "How silly of you!" Margaret scolded. "We must go and put it out at once. Stay where you are, and for goodness' sake, stop crying, or everyone in the house will hear you." So saying, Margaret hurried off, Alice and I with her, and on arriving outside my room, the door of which was wide open, we saw the lighted candle standing in the position Mary had described. I looked at the other girls and saw the unmistakable signs of fear lurking in the corners of their eyes. "Who will go first?" Margaret demanded. No one spoke. "Well, then," she said, "I will," and stepped over the threshold. The moment she did so, the door began to close. "This is curious," she cried, retreating before it. "Push!" We did. We all three pushed, but despite our efforts, the door came resolutely to, and we were all shut out. Then, before we had time to recover from our astonishment, it flew open, but again, before we could enter the room, the door came violently to, some unseen force holding it against us. "Let's make one more effort," Margaret said, "and if we don't succeed, we'll call for help." Obeying her instructions, we again pushed at the door. I was nearest the handle, and in some way, how, none of us could ever explain, just as the door suddenly opened of its own accord, I slipped and fell inside. The door then closed immediately with a bang, and to my unmitigated horror I found myself alone in the room. For some seconds I was spellbound, and could not even collect my thoughts sufficiently to frame a reply to the anxious entreaties of the other two girls, who kept banging on the door and imploring me to tell them what was happening. Never in the grip of nightmare had I experienced such terror as that room now conveyed to my mind. Though nothing was to be seen, nothing but the candle, the light of which was peculiarly white and vibrating, I felt the presence of something inexpressibly menacing and horrible. It was in the light, the atmosphere, the furniture, everywhere. On all sides it surrounded me. On all sides I was threatened in a manner that was strange and deadly. Something suggested to me that the source of evil originated in the candle, and that if I could succeed in extinguishing the light, I should free myself from the ghostly presence. Slowly I advanced towards the mantelpiece, and drawing in a deep breath, blew with the energy born of desperation. It had no effect. I repeated my efforts, blowing frantically, but all to no purpose. The candle still burned softly and mockingly. Then a fearful terror seized me, and flying to the opposite side of the room, I buried my face against the wall, waiting for what the sickly beatings of my heart warned me was coming. Constrained to look, I slightly, only very, very slightly, moved round, and there, floating stealthily towards me through the air, came the candle, the vibrating, glowing, baleful candle. I hid my face again and prayed God to let me faint. Nearer and nearer drew the light, wilder and wilder the girls' wenches at the door. Closer and closer I pressed myself to the wall. And then, when the final throes of agony were more than human heart and brain could stand, there came the suspicion, the suggestion of a touch. A touch so horrid that my prayers were at last answered, and I fainted. When I recovered, I was in Margaret's room, and half a dozen anxious friends gathered round me. It appears that on my collapse to the floor, the door, which had so effectually resisted every effort to turn the handle, immediately flew open, and I was discovered lying unconscious with the candle still alight on the floor beside me. My aunt experienced no difficulty in blowing out the recalcitrant candle, and I was carried with the greatest tenderness into the other wing of the house, where I slept that night. Little was said about the incident next day, but all who knew of it expressed in their faces the utmost anxiety, an anxiety which, now that I had recovered, greatly puzzled me. On our return home, another shock awaited me. We found to our dismay that my mother was seriously ill, and that the doctor, who had been sent for from Perth the previous evening, just about the time of my adventure with the candle, had stated that she might not survive the day. His warning was fulfilled. She died at sunset. Her death, of course, may have had nothing at all to do with the candle episode, yet it struck me then as an odd coincidence, and seems all the more strange to me after hearing your account of the bogle that touched your dear father in the road, so near the spot where the Holkit's house once stood. I could never discover whether Lady Holkit or her daughters ever saw anything of a superphysical nature in their house. After my experience, they were always very reticent on the subject, and naturally I did not like to press it. On Lady Holkit's death, Margaret and Alice sold the house, which was eventually pulled down, as no one would live in it, and I believe the ground on which it stood is now a turnip field. That, my dear, is all I can tell you. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, said Miss MacDonald, having heard our experiences, my mother's and mine, what is your opinion? Do you think the phenomenon of the candle was in any way connected with the bogle both you and I have seen, or are the hauntings of the old wet house entirely separate from those of the road? That question still remains on my file, unanswered.